A billionaire CEO stood inside a rundown garage, staring at a man covered in grease, and laughed. She controlled a global luxury empire worth billions. He owned a toolbox and a beat-up truck. She needed him more than she knew. When her million-dollar car broke down before the most important event of her life, every expert in the world failed her. Then someone said a quiet mechanic in a forgotten neighborhood could fix what no one else could. She didn't believe it. She was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her career. If you love stories about pride, redemption, and the people the world overlooks, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to hit like before we begin, because this one is going to stay with you. The garage had no sign. That was the first thing people noticed when they turned off Kellerman Avenue and followed the cracked asphalt path behind the old tire shop. There was no banner, no logo, no painted lettering above the rolling metal door, just a faded address number nailed to the cinder block wall, half obscured by a climbing weed that nobody had bothered to pull in years. Ethan Voss had never seen the point of advertising. The people who needed him found him eventually. The people who didn't, well, they had shinier options across town, and he had no interest in competing with places that spent more on their waiting room coffee machines than on actual tools. He was 32 years old and looked on most days exactly like what he was, a man who spent his life inside the guts of machines. His hands were permanently stained along the knuckle lines, no matter how hard he scrubbed. There was a small scar on his left forearm from a timing chain that had snapped during a late-night restoration job 4 years earlier, and he'd stitched it himself with a first aid kit from the shelf above the sink, because taking time off to sit in an emergency room wasn't something he could afford. His dark hair was always a little too long, always a little flattened on one side from wearing a work cap all day. He wasn't the kind of man people looked at twice on the street. That Tuesday morning started the same as every other. He was up before 6, standing at the small propane stove in the kitchen of the apartment attached to the back of the garage, a space that was technically a storage unit when he'd leased it, but which now contained a bed, a kitchenette, a second-hand couch, and every book about mechanical engineering he'd accumulated over 15 years. He was making oatmeal when he heard the small footsteps behind him. "You're up early," he said, without turning around. "I had a dream about the blue car," Mia said. She was 7, small for her age, with her mother's eyes and Ethan's stubborn jaw. She climbed onto the bar stool at the counter and pulled her knees up to her chest, watching him stir the pot with the focused expression she got when she was thinking hard about something. "Which blue car?" he asked. "The one with the broken door, the Mustang." "The Bronson Mustang doesn't have a broken door. It has a misaligned hinge and a cracked weather strip." "Same thing." "It really isn't." She thought about that for a moment. "Is it fixed yet?" "Getting there." Mia nodded seriously, as though she'd just received a project status update she found acceptable. She reached across the counter and stole a piece of toast from the plate he'd set out, and he let her because he'd made it for her anyway. This was the life he had built. It was small, it was sometimes difficult, but it was his and hers, and that felt like enough on most mornings. Ethan hadn't always worked in a garage with no sign on Kellerman Avenue. There was a version of his life, from roughly age 22 to 27, that looked nothing like this one. In that version, he worked in the controlled, climate-regulated restoration bays of Verdant Motor Works, an exclusive firm in the city that specialized in rare and historically significant vehicles. Vintage racing cars, pre-war European tours, one-of-a-kind concept vehicles that billionaires bought at auction and then stored in temperature-controlled facilities and never actually drove. Ethan had been their best restorer by the time he was 24. His supervisor, a former Formula One engineer named Calloway, used to say that Ethan could hear a problem in an engine the way musicians hear a wrong note, instantly, instinctively, without needing to think about it. He'd been good. He'd known he was good, and somewhere in that knowing, he'd made mistakes. He trusted the wrong business partners. He signed contracts he didn't read carefully enough. He got involved in a restoration deal that went sideways in ways he still didn't entirely understand. And by the time the legal situation resolved, he'd lost his savings. His professional reputation had been dragged through enough mud that no serious firm would touch him, and his marriage, already strained by the hours and the stress, had collapsed completely. Mia's mother, Cora, had left when Mia was 2. She wasn't a villain in his story. She'd been exhausted and scared, and she'd made the choice she needed to make. She'd signed over custody without a fight, which was the one thing Ethan remained quietly grateful for, and she'd moved to another city, and she sent birthday cards that sometimes arrived a week late. That was the shape of it. He'd taken Mia and the toolbox and the books and found the garage on Kellerman, and he'd started over. The regulars in the neighborhood knew him. Old Mr. Pacheco from the tire shop next door brought him tamales on the first Friday of every month without ever explaining why, and Ethan accepted them without asking. The Del Rey brothers, who ran a collision repair operation 3 blocks east, sent him overflow work when they got slammed, mostly older domestic vehicles that needed more patience than equipment. A woman named Greta, who collected pre-war German motorcycles, had found him through a forum post 2 years ago and now brought him work every few months, paying fairly and leaving him alone while he worked, which he considered the ideal client arrangement. He made enough. Not much more than enough, but enough. He was in the middle of the Bronson Mustang's hinge work, crouched beside the driver's door with a small fluorescent work light clipped to the doorframe, humming something tuneless under his breath, when he heard a car pull in. The sound of the car was the first thing that caught his attention. It was a black sedan, recent model, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of vehicle that cost a great deal of money while being specifically designed to not look like it. It parked in the narrow lot in front of the garage with the precise, unhurried movement of a driver who was paid to be invisible. 2 people got out. The first was a man in a dark jacket, mid-40s, carrying a leather folder. Assistant or security or some combination of both. The second was a woman. She was around 30, maybe a year or 2 either direction, and she was dressed the way people dress when they want to look casual but have spent considerable money achieving that appearance. Dark slacks, a fitted gray jacket, hair pulled back. She wore a single watch that Ethan recognized immediately as a Vacheron Constantin, worth more than his annual income, and she moved with the automatic confidence of someone who almost never walked into a room where she wasn't the most powerful person present. She looked at the garage. Her expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. A quick recalibration, the kind people do when the reality in front of them doesn't match the expectation they arrived with. She'd expected something better than this. Ethan set down his wrench and stood up. "Help you with something?" The man with the folder stepped slightly forward. "Is this Ethan Voss?" "Yeah. My name is Gerald Marsh. I'm the Executive Operations Director for Hartwell Industries." A practiced pause. "This is Isabella Hartwell." The name registered. He'd have had to be living under a very large rock for it not to. Isabella Hartwell had appeared on the covers of business publications twice in the past year alone. Her company, which had started as her late father's mid-tier auto parts distribution business, had expanded under her control into a multinational luxury empire spanning automotive accessories, high-end vehicle leasing, and exclusive collectors' acquisitions. She was worth somewhere north of $8 billion, depending on which article you read. She was standing in his garage looking at him the way people sometimes looked at food they weren't sure was still good. "I know who you are," Ethan said. "Good," Isabella said. Her voice was controlled, precise, the kind of voice that had been trained, consciously or not, to project authority in rooms full of people who expected authority. "Then I'll save the introduction. I have a vehicle that needs restoration. I was told you might be capable of handling it." "Might be." He reached for a shop rag and wiped his hands. "What's the vehicle?" Marsh opened the folder and produced a photograph. He held it out. Ethan took it and looked. The car in the photo was a Hartwell Grand Touring Speciale, one of 3 ever built, all custom ordered, each one carrying a price tag in the range of $4 to $6 million, depending on configuration. This particular one was finished in a deep midnight blue with silver coachwork details, and even in the photograph the proportions were extraordinary. Long hood, low roofline, the kind of silhouette that made you stop. He'd seen photographs of this specific car before. It had appeared in collector circles about 3 years ago when Isabella acquired it at a private auction. The automotive press had covered the acquisition the way entertainment reporters covered celebrity weddings. "What happened to it?" he asked. 6 weeks ago, it was involved in an incident on the elevated highway outside of Meridian Point, Isabella said. "A tire blowout." The driver managed to control the vehicle and avoid a collision, but the strain on the drivetrain was severe. There was also a secondary impact. Minor, another vehicle made contact with the rear quarter panel at low speed while pulling over to assist. And the failures? Marsh pulled out a second document, a technical report, dense with data. Irregular power delivery at mid-range RPM, intermittent hydraulic pressure drops in the braking system. Two separate specialty firms examined the vehicle and identified different problems. Neither repair fully resolved the issues. How many miles does she have? 4,211, Isabella said. Ethan looked at her. 4,000 miles, and you've had it to 2 shops already. 3, if you count the dealership. And none of them fixed it. Correct. He looked back at the photograph. 4,000 miles. A vehicle barely broken in, built by craftsmen who spent years perfecting its components, and somehow it was defeating specialists. That was interesting. That was the kind of problem that made his hands want to start working before his brain had finished asking questions. Where is it now? He asked. In a secured transport vehicle around the corner, Marsh said. We didn't want to bring it onto the property without first determining whether I was worth the trouble, Ethan said. A beat of silence. Whether the facility was appropriate, Marsh said carefully. Isabella, to her credit, didn't pretend otherwise. She glanced around the garage, at the Mustang with its door propped open, at the parts arranged in careful order on the steel shelving along the far wall, at the diagnostic equipment in the corner that was older than anything in her company's service centers, but was maintained with a precision that would have impressed people who knew what to look for. You came highly recommended, she said, and the way she said it made clear that she found this somewhat difficult to reconcile with what she was currently looking at. By Marcus Delaney. That name meant something. Marcus Delaney was one of the most respected automotive journalists in the country, a man who had spent 40 years writing about cars with an honesty and depth that the industry both valued and occasionally feared. He'd contacted Ethan 3 years ago about a 1968 Alfa Romeo he was restoring privately, and they'd spent 4 months working through a complex mechanical rebuild together. Delaney knew cars the way poets knew language, and he didn't give referrals casually. Marcus is good people, Ethan said. He was very specific, Isabella said. He said, and I'm quoting, that if your car has a problem nobody else can find, Ethan Voss will find it. He also said you were difficult to work with. He's not wrong about either. She studied him for a moment. Something crossed her face. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation. It was the expression of someone encountering a person who wasn't adjusting their behavior to accommodate her presence and finding it unexpected. The showcase is in 41 days, she said. The Grand Touring Speciale is scheduled to be the centerpiece. The automotive press will be there. Our investors will be there. The Hartwell brand is, she paused, choosing the word carefully, closely associated with this vehicle at the moment. Its absence or its underperformance would be visible. I understand the stakes, Ethan said. Do you? The question wasn't aggressive. It was genuinely assessing. The previous 2 firms had full teams. Combined, they put 37 specialist hours into this vehicle. They had access to the original manufacturer's schematics, proprietary diagnostic tools, a direct technical line to the coach builder. And it's still broken. Yes. Ethan folded the photograph in half and set it on his workbench. Bring it around. Marsh blinked. I'm sorry? The car. Bring it around. I want to look at it before I tell you whether I can help you. Isabella looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she gave a small nod to Marsh, who stepped outside and made a call. The transport vehicle was a custom enclosed trailer, clean, professional, climate-controlled. The driver lowered the ramp with practiced efficiency, and they all watched as the Grand Touring Speciale rolled slowly forward into the thin morning light. Even there, in the cracked parking lot behind a tire shop on Kellerman Avenue, the car was stunning. Ethan walked to it slowly. He circled it once without touching it. He crouched at the rear quarter panel and looked at the contact damage. Minor, as described, but the repair had been handled by someone who'd matched the paint but hadn't understood the original finish's layering. He stood and ran his hand along the door seam, feeling the gap tolerances. He opened the hood. The engine was a hand-assembled 6.8-liter touring unit, one of a kind, built to this vehicle's specific specifications by a team of engineers in Belgium. He looked at it for a long time. Behind him, he was dimly aware of Isabella watching him, of Marsh making small notes in his folder, of Mia, who had appeared in the garage doorway at some point, silently observing with the serious expression she wore when she was filing information away. "What do you see?" Isabella asked, finally. There was something in her voice, a careful control that suggested she wanted to know, but didn't want to seem like she needed to know. Ethan straightened up. "The previous shops were looking at symptoms," he said. "The irregular power delivery, the brake pressure drops. They treated those as separate problems and tried to fix them separately." "They're not separate?" "I think they have a common source." He pointed to a section of the engine bay, the wiring harness routing along the left side. "This needs to come apart before I can confirm it. But I think there's a grounding fault that's been compounding. When the highway incident happened, the vibration stress on the chassis may have shifted the harness in a way that created intermittent contact failures. Depending on temperature and load, it presents differently. That's why the symptoms seemed unrelated." Silence. "None of the other specialists suggested that," Marsh said. "I know." He looked at Isabella. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. It was somewhere between professional calculation and something more genuine, though she seemed to be working to keep the latter from showing. "Can you fix it in 41 days?" she said. "I can fix it," Ethan said. "How long that takes depends on what I find when I open it up." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now." She held his gaze. This, he understood, was a test. Not of his ability, which she'd already half accepted, but of his character. She wanted to see if he'd fold and give her a more comfortable answer to make the sale. He didn't. "All right," she said at last. "What do you need?" "A written agreement on scope, rate, and timeline adjustments. And I need the original build specifications from the coach builder. Not the service manual, the actual build spec. The coach builder's documentation is proprietary." "Then call them and tell them you need it shared, because without it, I'm working with part of the picture." Another silence. Marsh looked at Isabella. She looked at the car, then at Ethan. "I'll make the call," she said. She walked back toward the sedan. Marsh followed, already on his phone. Ethan turned back to the car and stood looking at it for a long moment. "Dad?" said Mia from the doorway. He glanced back. "She didn't say please," Mia noted. Ethan picked up his work rag and turned back toward the garage. "No," he agreed. "She didn't." He wasn't worried about that yet. He was thinking about a wiring harness and a grounding fault, and the particular kind of problem that defeats experts not because it's complicated, but because everyone looks in the wrong direction. He was thinking about the car. That was always, for better or worse, where his mind went first. The build specs arrived 2 days later. Not from Isabella directly. She didn't call, didn't send Marsh back to the garage, didn't offer any acknowledgement that a decision had been made. A courier showed up Thursday morning with a sealed envelope containing a USB drive and a single-page confidentiality agreement. Ethan signed the agreement at the workbench, handed it back to the courier, and plugged in the drive while his coffee went cold beside him. The documents were in Dutch, 47 pages of them. He spent that first evening running them through a translation tool, then cross-referencing the translated text against his own knowledge of the coach builder's methods, a Belgian firm called Van Thorp Atelier that had been producing bespoke bodywork and custom mechanical integrations for European collectors since the early 1970s. He'd never worked on one of their vehicles directly, but he'd spent years reading everything he could find about how they built things, the way other people read novels. Van Thorp had specific engineering philosophies that didn't always align with conventional automotive logic, and those philosophies were documented in their build specs in a kind of shorthand that required context to understand. He read until 2 in the morning. Mia had fallen asleep on the couch at some point with a book open across her chest, something about rocks and how they formed, her current obsession. And he'd carried her to bed without waking her and then gone back to the specs. When he finally turned off the work light and stretched his back and looked at the time, he felt the particular wired exhaustion of someone whose brain is running fast even as their body is done. He was right about the grounding fault. But it was more complicated than he'd initially thought. The Vanthorpe build spec revealed something that hadn't appeared in any of the previous service documentation. The Grand Touring Speciale's chassis used a dual-layer grounding architecture, a primary system and a secondary that was meant to act as a redundant failsafe. The secondary system ran through a different routing path than the primary, and its connection points were partially integrated into the body structure rather than the chassis frame. In most conditions, you'd never know the secondary system existed because you'd never need it. But if the primary grounding developed a fault, which the highway incident had apparently caused, the secondary was supposed to compensate automatically. It wasn't compensating. The reason, as best Ethan could determine from the spec and from 2 hours spent under the car with a flashlight and a multimeter, was that the secondary system's integration points had been subtly compromised during the original bodywork repair from the minor highway contact. Someone had repaired the body damage correctly on the surface without understanding that the body structure underneath served a grounding function. They'd used the wrong bonding compound on the interior panel seam, and it had created a resistance point that was disrupting the secondary system's reliability. It was the kind of mistake that was genuinely hard to catch. You'd have to know the dual-layer architecture existed, understand how the secondary routing interacted with the body structure, and then think to connect a bodywork repair to an electrical grounding failure. The specialists who'd worked on the car before were good at what they did. They just hadn't had the specific knowledge to see all three of those things at once. Ethan sat with this for a while, alone in the garage at 2:30 in the morning, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle that had finally given up its answer. Then he felt the size of the actual work in front of him. Fixing the grounding wasn't the hard part. The hard part was that accessing the secondary grounding integration points required partially disassembling a section of the rear interior, removing trim panels that had been fitted and finished by Vanthorpe craftsmen to tolerances that wouldn't survive being taken apart carelessly. The bonding compound issue had to be corrected without damaging the surrounding structure. And while he was in there, the primary grounding fault also needed a proper repair, not the patch job one of the previous shops had apparently attempted. Beyond the electrical issues, there was something else the specs helped him identify. The brake hydraulic irregularities were a separate matter entirely. A small seal in the master cylinder had begun to fail. Early stage, intermittent, the kind of thing that would get dramatically worse under hard braking. The previous shops had checked the obvious hydraulic components and hadn't found it because the seal was only leaking under specific pressure conditions. He found it with a pressure test at 3 different load points, and when he found it, he sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath, because a failing master cylinder seal on a car that would be driven in a public automotive showcase was not a small problem. The next morning, he called Marsh. "I need to talk to Ms. Hartwell," he said. "Ms. Hartwell doesn't generally take direct calls regarding, I found 2 separate problems. One of them is a safety issue, so she can either talk to me directly or she can find someone else." A pause. "I'll see what I can arrange." Isabella called back 40 minutes later. He was under the car when his phone buzzed, and he slid out and answered it with grease on his forearm and the fluorescent work light still clipped to the exhaust cross member behind him. "You said there's a safety issue," she said, without preamble. No greeting. "Master cylinder seal. Early stage failure. Under normal driving, you might not notice it for weeks. Under hard braking at speed, it could become a serious problem." A silence on the line. He could hear what sounded like a meeting in the background. Voices. The scrape of chairs. "The previous inspection didn't find that," she said. "The previous inspection didn't pressure test at multiple load points. They checked the system at rest." "Can you fix it?" "Yes, but I need a specific seal kit. It's a custom component, not off the shelf. I need to source it from a hydraulic specialist who can match the original tolerances." "How long?" "To source the part, 4 to 5 days. To install it correctly, another 2 days after that. While I'm waiting for the part, I'll be working on the grounding issue. That's the other problem." He explained the dual-layer architecture, the bodywork repair error, what needed to happen to correct it. He kept it straightforward, not simplified, because he had a sense that talking down to Isabella Hartwell would go over about as well as setting money on fire, but not padded with unnecessary technical language either. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Nobody mentioned a dual-layer grounding system," she said. "It's in the build specs. page 31 of the Vanthorpe documentation. They don't advertise it. It's part of their proprietary integration philosophy. You read the specs in 2 days. I read them the night they arrived. Another pause, longer this time. What's the timeline? If the seal kit arrives when I expect it to, and if I don't find additional problems when I open up the interior panels, which I might, so I'm not promising that, you're looking at 3 weeks for the core repairs, another week for testing and adjustment. That puts you at 4 weeks total, with a week of buffer before the showcase. And if you find additional problems, then I'll call you. She seemed to be weighing something. He could almost feel the calculation happening across the silence. Do what you need to do, she said finally. Marsh will handle the part sourcing authorization. She ended the call. Ethan set the phone on the workbench and looked at the car. At the Hartwell Grand Touring Speciale sitting in his garage on Kellerman Avenue, taking up nearly the entire available floor space, the morning light catching the midnight blue of its bodywork in a way that made the paint look like it was several inches deep. It was, he thought, a remarkable piece of work. However much he had reservations about the world that produced vehicles like this, the world of 8-figure net worths and showcase events and collector acquisitions that treated machinery as status, the car itself was something else. It had been made by people who cared about making it correctly. He respected that, independent of everything else. He pulled on his gloves and got back to work. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Ethan was in the garage by 6:30 each morning. He worked through the interior panel removal with the kind of patience that felt almost meditative. Each fastener documented, each trim piece wrapped in clean cloth and stored in labeled bins so that nothing would be misidentified during reassembly. The Vanthorpe craftsman had used a combination of conventional mechanical fasteners and a specific adhesive bonding system, and where the adhesive was involved, he had to work slowly with a thin plastic tool to release the panels without stress fractures. Mia watched him sometimes from the office corner where she'd set up a small table with her colored pencils and her books. She'd taken to drawing the car from different angles, not glamorous renderings, but careful observational sketches, the kind that tried to get the proportions right. She had her mother's eye for spatial relationships, and her drawings were better than they had any right to be at 7. "What's that part?" she asked one afternoon, pointing at a component he'd just removed from the interior structure. "Grounding strap," he said. "What does it do?" "It gives electricity a safe path to travel. Without it, the electricity gets confused and goes places it's not supposed to." She thought about this with the serious frown she used for things that interested her. Like when water finds cracks in the ceiling? He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." She went back to her drawing, apparently satisfied. He called in a favor with a hydraulic specialist named Priya Nandini, a woman who ran a precision components shop across the city and whom he'd helped out 3 years earlier when she'd needed advice on a brake system problem she couldn't solve. She sourced the seal kit in 4 days, 1 day ahead of his estimate, and drove it out to the garage herself rather than shipping it because she knew he was working against a deadline. "Hartwell Industries," she said, looking at the car while Ethan signed the delivery invoice. "That's a different level for you. The car needed fixing." "Sure." She walked around the front of the vehicle slowly, head tilted. "Is it as complicated as they say?" "Weirder," he said. Vanthorpe used a secondary grounding architecture through the body structure. Nobody in the previous shops knew about it. Priya stopped walking and looked at him. "A structural ground in the body panels?" "Partial integration, the rear quarter section, it's documented in the build spec." She shook her head. "That's either brilliant or completely insane." "Probably both. It works perfectly when everything is intact. When somebody repairs the body without knowing the ground is routed through it, it stops working perfectly." She left him the parts and wished him luck, which she said in the specific way people say it when they mean they're genuinely glad they're not the one doing the job. The grounding work was the most demanding thing he'd done in 2 years. He had to access 3 separate integration points inside the rear structure, clean the bonding surfaces, apply a conductive bonding compound that matched the Vanthorpe specification, which he'd had to source from a specialty supplier in Germany, a process that had involved 2 phone calls and a significant amount of patience, and then seal and refinish the panel interior to its original condition. Each step had to be done correctly before the next one could start. There was no shortcut path through this. He didn't look for one. He installed the master cylinder seal on day 11. That job was precise and time-consuming, but in the way he was comfortable with, familiar hydraulic principles, just applied to custom components. When he finished and ran the pressure test at all 3 load points, the system held perfectly. He ran it again, then a third time. Clean. He allowed himself a moment to just sit on the floor beside the car with his back against the front wheel and drink the lukewarm coffee Mia had made him an hour earlier without his asking. The garage smelled like solvent and warm metal and the faint sweetness of whatever Mia had been eating at her corner table. He could hear the street noise from Kellerman outside and Mr. Pacheco's compressor cycling next door, and somewhere distant the sound of a truck backing up. "You look tired," Mia said from across the garage. "I am tired. Are you done?" "Not yet." "Okay." She returned to her drawing. "I made you a sandwich. It's in the mini fridge." "When did you make me a sandwich?" "Before. You didn't notice." He hadn't noticed. He thought about that, about all the small things she managed without announcement, the sandwiches and the coffee and the way she straightened the tools on the lower shelf sometimes when he was deep in a job and his organization had started to slip, 7 years old and already looking after him in the ways she could. It made him feel something that he didn't have a clean word for. Pride, yes, but also something more uncomfortable. The awareness of how much was riding on his ability to keep their life together and how thin the margin sometimes felt. The payment for this job, if it came through the way the contract specified, would be the largest single amount he'd received in 4 years. It would cover Mia's enrollment in the science and engineering enrichment program she'd been on the waiting list for. It would let him replace the lift system in the garage that had been intermittently unreliable for 8 months. It would put enough in reserve that one slow month wouldn't feel like a crisis. He thought about that as he got up and went to get the sandwich. The second week moved faster. Once the grounding and hydraulic work was complete, the remaining issues resolved in sequence. He found a minor coolant routing problem while doing a general systems check. Not critical, but left unaddressed, it would have created a hot spot under sustained highway driving. He fixed it. He adjusted the throttle response calibration, which had been slightly off since the highway incident had stressed the drive-by-wire system. He replaced a worn auxiliary belt that had another few thousand miles in it, but not many more. He didn't charge for the belt separately. It was the kind of thing he'd noticed and couldn't unfind. On day 18, he started the car. The engine turned over and settled into its idle, and the sound it made was, he didn't have a better word for it, right. The particular frequency of a well-built engine running without strain or hesitation, every component handling its function correctly, the whole system in a kind of mechanical conversation with itself that worked. He sat in the driver's seat and ran through a systematic check. Every system he could test while stationary, he tested. Then he pulled out of the garage and onto Kellerman Avenue and drove the car for the first time. The street was narrow and not suited for evaluating a grand touring vehicle, but he wasn't evaluating its performance yet. He was listening, feeling, learning what the car communicated about itself through the steering and the pedals and the vibration pattern through the seat. He drove 6 blocks, turned around, drove back. He did this 4 times. Then he parked, got out, walked around the vehicle, crouched at each wheel, stood up, and went inside to write down everything he'd observed. On day 21, 3 days ahead of his initial estimate, he called Marsh and told him the core repairs were complete and the vehicle was ready for a test drive evaluation. Marsh called back within the hour. "Ms. Hartwell would like to send her driver." "Tell him to bring comfortable clothes," Ethan said. "He'll be in the car for a while." The driver arrived the next morning. His name was Roland, and he had the manner of a man who had been driving high-performance vehicles for professionals his whole career. Not easily impressed, not easily alarmed, the kind of driver who gathered information with minimal expression and reported it accurately. He shook Ethan's hand, walked around the car twice, got in, and drove away. He was gone for 2.5 hours. Ethan used the time to clean the garage and check in on a transmission job he'd been doing for the Delray brothers in between sessions on the Hartwell car. Mia read her rock book and asked him whether granite was harder than quartz, and he told her to look at the Mohs scale in the back of the book. And she did, and then she told him the answer and seemed pleased that the book had contained it. When Roland came back, He parked the car with the particular careful precision of someone who understands the thing they're handling has value. He got out and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at the garage. "So?" Ethan said. Roland exhaled slowly. "The brake response is cleaner than it was when the car was new," he said. "I drove this vehicle at delivery 3 years ago. The pedal feel was good then. This is better. The master cylinder seal was degraded from the start, probably," Ethan said. "Small manufacturing variants. Nothing that would have failed the quality check, but enough to affect feel under threshold braking." Roland looked at him with the unhurried attention of a man recalibrating. "The power delivery is completely linear now. No hesitation at mid-range. Grounding fault. It was affecting the engine management system intermittently. And the..." Roland paused. "There's something different in the high-speed stability. I took it up to highway speed on the connector road. It tracked differently than before. More settled. Coolant roading. There was a hot spot developing under the front subframe. It was affecting the thermal expansion of the steering rack under sustained load. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But enough to introduce a subtle pull at speed." Roland stared at him. "The previous shops didn't catch that either," Ethan said. "It wasn't a boast. It was just a fact." "No," Roland said. "They didn't." He looked at the car again, then back at Ethan. "I've been driving for Isabella Hartwell for 6 years. In that time, I've watched 3 different specialist firms work on vehicles in her collection. Some of them were good." He paused. "You're better." Ethan wiped his hands on the shop rag. "I had better documentation. You had the same documentation the second firm had. I know because I was there when it was requested." That was interesting. Ethan thought about it for a moment and didn't say anything because there wasn't much to say. Roland took out his phone and made a call. He walked a few feet away and spoke quietly for several minutes. When he came back, he said, "Ms. Hartwell would like to see the vehicle herself. Tomorrow morning, if that works." "That works." After Roland drove away in the transport vehicle, Ethan stood outside the garage in the thin afternoon light and breathed in the cool air and let the quiet stretch out for a while. The job was essentially done. The invoicing was prepared. He'd worked it up 2 days earlier based on hours, parts, and the specialty sourcing costs. It was a significant number. He'd gone back and checked it twice to make sure he hadn't miscounted anything, because the number was large enough that he'd been slightly uncomfortable with it, and then he'd checked the contract and confirmed that the number was fair, and then he'd stopped second-guessing himself. Inside, Mia had fallen asleep at her corner table, with her cheek on her rock book and her colored pencil still in her hand, a half-finished sketch of the Grand Touring Speciale beside her on the table. He stood in the doorway looking at her for a moment. The sketch was good. She'd gotten the roofline right. He went to the mini-fridge and found a container of leftover pasta from 2 nights ago and ate it cold while reviewing his work notes, checking off items, making sure nothing had been missed. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. Outside, the evening was coming down over Kellerman Avenue, and the tire shop went quiet as Mr. Pacheco locked up for the night, and the distant sound of the city carried in through the propped-open side door. The car was ready. He was reasonably sure of that. He was not, and had never been, the kind of person who felt certain of things. Certainty was for people who hadn't seen enough go wrong. But he was as close to certain as his nature allowed. He had gone through every system twice. He had documented every repair. He had tested everything testable. The vehicle was, in his professional judgment, not only roadworthy, but outstanding. He thought about Isabella Hartwell arriving tomorrow in her expensive sedan, looking at the car with those assessing eyes, running her hand along the door seam the same way he had that first morning. He wondered what she would see. Then he cleared his notes from the workbench, turned off the garage light, and went to wake Mia gently so she could go to bed in an actual bed, in the small apartment that still didn't have working heat in the second room but which was theirs, which had been theirs through everything, which was enough. The invoice was on the desk. The car was ready in the bay. Tomorrow, he'd find out what Isabella Hartwell's version of fair looked like. Isabella arrived at 9:15. She was 7 minutes late, which Ethan suspected was not an accident, the kind of small power move that people in her position deployed without thinking about it, the way a habit becomes invisible through repetition. He was under the hood of Mr. Pacheco's nephew's Civic, when the black sedan pulled in, and he didn't stop what he was doing until he'd finished tightening the air intake clamp he'd been working on, because leaving a job half done to stand at attention wasn't something he did for anyone. He wiped his hands and walked out to meet her. She was dressed differently than the first visit. Sharper, more formal, a charcoal blazer over a dark blouse, heels on the cracked asphalt of his parking lot that she navigated without apparent difficulty. Marsh was with her again, and a second person he hadn't seen before. A woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a tablet in her hand, who had the specific energy of someone whose job was to find problems. "Mr. Voss," Isabella said. "Miss Hartwell." He nodded toward the garage. "It's inside." She walked in ahead of him. The Grand Touring Speciale was positioned in the center of the bay, the overhead lights on, every panel clean. He detailed the exterior the previous afternoon. Not elaborately, just a thorough wash and a single pass of finishing wax, because returning a vehicle dirty after a month of work was disrespectful to the machine regardless of who owned it. Isabella stopped just inside the doorway. She looked at the car for a long moment without speaking. Her expression was doing something complicated. He could see the professional assessment happening, the cataloging of visible condition. But underneath it, something else moved briefly across her face. Something that might have been relief, though she controlled it quickly. "Roland's report was positive," she said, not quite to him, not quite to herself. "He's a good driver," Ethan said. "Gave me useful feedback." The woman with the tablet, Isabella introduced her as Dr. Soren, their internal automotive systems specialist, walked a slow circuit around the vehicle, pausing at the rear quarter panel where the original body damage had been, crouching to examine the lower sill, running a practiced eye along the roofline. She didn't touch anything yet. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the hood release. "Go ahead." Dr. Soren opened the hood and stood looking at the engine bay for a long time. She asked Ethan 3 technical questions about the grounding repair, specific, intelligent questions that told him she'd read Roland's report carefully and understood enough to probe the areas that mattered. He answered them directly, walked her through the repair sequence, showed her the documentation he'd kept at each stage. She looked at the documentation for several minutes. Then she looked at him. "You photographed each step," she said. "I always do." The second firm we used, Callworth Automotive. Their documentation was 4 pages. "Yours is," she scrolled on her tablet, 61 pages, including the parts sourcing records. "I documented what I did. That's what 61 pages looks like." Dr. Soren glanced at Isabella, and something passed between them that Ethan didn't have full context for. Isabella had moved to the driver's side door and was standing with her arms crossed, looking at the interior through the window. "Can it be driven?" Isabella asked. "That's what cars are for," Ethan said. A short silence. "I'd like Roland to take me out." "He's your driver. That's your call." She took out her phone and made a call. Roland arrived 11 minutes later. He had apparently been parked somewhere nearby, on standby, and Isabella got into the passenger seat with the composed efficiency of someone who did not experience nervousness as a concept she had much use for. Roland drove them out of the garage and onto Kellerman Avenue, and Ethan watched the midnight blue car move through the narrow street with the unhurried authority of something that had been built correctly and was now performing correctly, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a problem fully solved. Mia appeared beside him in the garage doorway. "Is she nice?" Mia asked. Ethan thought about it honestly. "She's competent," he said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." Mia went back inside. They were gone for 40 minutes. When the car returned, Roland parked it with the same careful precision as before, and Isabella stepped out and stood beside the vehicle for a moment with one hand resting lightly on the roof. It was an unguarded moment, the kind that surfaces when someone doesn't realize they're being observed, and in it, she looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a person who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. Then she turned and saw him watching, and the composure came back up like a curtain. "Dr. Soren will complete a technical sign-off evaluation," she said. "Assuming that clears, we'll process the invoice." "The invoice is on the workbench," Ethan said. "Marsh has a copy already." She nodded. "We'll review it." That was the phrase that should have told him something. Not "we'll process it," not "we'll issue payment," "we'll review it." He heard it and noted it and didn't assign it the weight he perhaps should have, because in his experience, a contract was a contract, and the work was documented, and the outcome spoke for itself. He'd spent his career in a world where those things were the currency of trust, and he'd never fully learned to distrust them the way the situation sometimes warranted. Dr. Soren's evaluation took 3 hours. She drove the vehicle herself on a second extended test loop, then returned and spent an additional 90 minutes going through systems with her own diagnostic equipment. Ethan answered her questions, showed her the parts receipts, walked her through the specialty seal kit sourcing from Priya Nandini's shop. At the end of it, Dr. Soren packed up her equipment and wrote something on her tablet and showed it to Marsh without showing it to Ethan. Marsh nodded. "We'll be in touch about the invoice," he said. They left. The car went back on the transport trailer. Ethan stood in the empty bay. The space where the Grand Touring Speciale had lived for 22 days suddenly vast and ordinary again, and looked at the oil-stained floor and the careful rows of labeled parts bins and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and thought about the phrase "we'll review it," and tried to decide how much it bothered him. He decided he was fine. He was probably fine. He went back to the Civic. The call came 5 days later. Not from Isabella, not even from Marsh. From a woman named Hendricks in the Hartwell Industries accounts department, who spoke with the brisk neutrality of someone delivering information that wasn't her problem. She told him that Hartwell Industries had reviewed the invoice and was prepared to issue payment in the amount of $38,000. Ethan sat down on the stool at his workbench. The invoice was for $71,400. He'd built it line by line, labor hours at his standard rate, parts at cost, specialty sourcing at cost, plus a 10% handling fee that was below industry standard. He'd actually gone back and checked twice because he'd been worried the number was too high. It wasn't too high. The contract had specified his rate, specified the parts reimbursement structure, and the work performed was documented to the page. "There must be an error," he said. His voice came out flat. The contract amount is being reviewed," Hendricks said, in the tone of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Ms. Hartwell has determined that a portion of the restoration work exceeded the original agreed scope. The adjusted payment reflects the work that was within scope." "What portion," Ethan said, "exceeded scope?" "I'm not in a position to discuss the specifics. You'll receive written communication from our legal department within—" "Put me through to Marsh." A pause. "Mr. Marsh is not available." "Then I'll wait." Another pause. "Mr. Voss, the decision has been made at the executive level. I'd recommend—" "Thank you," Ethan said, and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand. The garage was quiet. A truck passed on Kellerman outside. The compressor next door cycled on. He sat there for probably 3 minutes, which felt longer. Then he called Marsh's direct line, which he had from the original documentation exchange. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 sentences. He'd received the call from accounts, the adjusted amount wasn't consistent with the contract, and he'd like to discuss it before either party took further steps. He did not raise his voice. He did not use language he'd regret. He put the phone down and picked up his wrench and went back to the Civic, because the alternator bracket still needed to come off, and the car needed to be done by Thursday. The written communication from the legal department arrived by email the following morning. It was 4 pages long and had clearly been prepared in advance. The specificity with which it characterized the disputed work items told him it hadn't been drafted in 5 days since the car left his garage. Someone had been building this argument while the vehicle was still being repaired. He read it twice. The legal letter claimed that Ethan had performed work on the vehicle's hydraulic system beyond the original diagnostic scope, specifically citing the master cylinder seal replacement as an item that should have required separate authorization. It claimed the interior panel disassembly and reassembly constituted a separate restoration category, not covered under the original agreement. It characterized the coolant rerouting as an unauthorized modification. Combined, these items, which represented the core of the actual repair work, were being reclassified as outside the contract scope, leaving only the electrical grounding correction and a few minor items as billable. The argument was, technically, not completely insane. The original contract had been written in general terms: restoration and repair of identified mechanical and electrical faults. And it hadn't enumerated specific systems because they hadn't known what they'd find until Ethan started looking. That ambiguity, which at the time of signing had seemed like a reasonable allowance for the unknown nature of the job, was now being used as a gap. He thought about calling a lawyer. He knew one, a woman named Carver, who'd helped him with a contract dispute 3 years earlier, the one that had cost him Verdant Motor Works and everything attached to it. Carver was good. She was also expensive, and the process would take months, and he was not in a position where months of legal process was a viable plan. He thought about Marcus Delaney, who'd sent Isabella to him in the first place. He thought about calling Delaney and explaining the situation. He dismissed it almost immediately. Delaney had done him a favor with the referral, and turning it into a conflict wasn't something he was willing to do. He thought about going to the press. There were automotive journalists who'd be interested in a story about a billionaire refusing to pay an independent mechanic. He knew some of them. He dismissed that too because the thought of his name in that kind of story, of Mia eventually reading something like that about her father, sat wrong with him in a way he couldn't reason his way past. What he kept coming back to was simpler and less satisfying. He'd done the work. He'd done it correctly. He'd done it honestly. And someone with more resources and more lawyers than he would ever have had looked at the invoice and decided to pay him half because she could. He took the legal letter and folded it carefully and put it in the folder with the contract and his documentation. And he put the folder on the shelf above the workbench where he kept important papers. Then he thought about Mia's enrichment program. The enrollment deadline was 6 weeks away. The deposit was $1,500, which he'd been counting on from this payment. The full tuition was $3,200, which he'd also been counting on. He could cover the deposit from his existing savings without destroying his operating reserve. Barely. The tuition would be harder. He sat with that calculation for a while and didn't like the numbers. That afternoon, he drove to the Hartwell Industries offices. He hadn't called ahead. He knew if he called ahead, he'd get Marcia's voicemail or Hendricks from accounts, or polite obstruction from someone whose job was to prevent this exact kind of meeting from happening. He drove across the city in his pickup with the invoice and the contract on the passenger seat, parked in the visitor lot of the Hartwell Tower on Meridian Boulevard, walked to the reception desk, and told the woman there that he had a contractual matter to discuss with Isabella Hartwell and that he didn't have an appointment. The woman at the desk, young, professional, accustomed to managing exactly this kind of situation, asked his name, made a call, listened for a moment, and then told him politely that Ms. Hartwell was not available and that he should contact the legal department. "I know she's not available to me," Ethan said. "Can you tell her I'm here and I'd like 5 minutes?" The woman made a second call. She listened again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Voss. You'll need to—" "I know," he said. "Thank you." He walked back to the truck. He sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and looked at the glass tower with its Hartwell Industries branding across the top and felt, not rage exactly, something quieter and more corrosive, the specific feeling of having done everything right and watching it not matter. He drove home. That night, Mia found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, staring at the middle distance with the look she associated with the complicated days. She climbed onto the chair across from him and put her chin in her hands and looked at him. "The car lady," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "She didn't pay you?" He looked at his daughter, at this small, watchful, entirely too perceptive person who was 7 years old and already understood more about how the world worked than he sometimes wanted her to. "Not what we agreed on," he said. Mia was quiet for a moment. "Did you fix the car?" "Yes." "Did you fix it right?" "Yeah, Mia, I fixed it right." She nodded slowly, with the gravity she brought to things she was filing away as important. "Then she should pay you." "She should," he agreed. "Are you going to make her?" He thought about that. The real answer, not the one that would reassure her. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do." She seemed to accept that. She got up, went to the small refrigerator, found a can of sparkling water she'd been saving for something, brought it back, set it in front of him. "You should drink something that isn't cold coffee," she said, and went to her room. He looked at the sparkling water for a moment. Then he opened it and drank some, because she wasn't wrong, and because there were worse things in the world than being looked after by a 7-year-old who noticed things. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of the period. He filed a formal written dispute with Hartwell Industries' legal department, outlining specifically why the work performed was within the original contract scope. The response he received, 11 days later, was a slightly modified version of the original position. They moved on one item, a parts cost discrepancy, and offered a total of $41,200, a concession so small it felt like a gesture designed to look like good faith without actually being it. He kept working. The Delray brothers sent him a transmission rebuild on a vintage Ford pickup, and he worked through it methodically and finished it in 4 days and got paid promptly and without conflict, the way most of his work went. A woman named Cassidy brought him a 1971 Porsche 914 with a fuel delivery problem that turned out to be a collapsed fuel line inside the tank, and that job was genuinely interesting and took most of a week. And he was grateful for it because interesting problems were the best kind of distraction from the uninteresting ones. He didn't talk about the Hartwell situation publicly. He didn't post about it. He didn't call the automotive press contacts he'd been considering. He did call Carver, the lawyer, and spent 45 minutes on the phone going through the contract and the legal correspondence, and Carver told him what he'd already suspected. He had a reasonable case. The contract language was genuinely ambiguous in ways that favored him but didn't guarantee him, and pursuing it formally would take 6 to 12 months and cost him in fees that would reduce whatever he recovered to something approaching the offered amount anyway. My professional opinion, Carver said, is that they wrote the contract that way on purpose, not necessarily targeting you specifically, but as a general practice. Ambiguous scope language protects them in exactly this situation. That's useful to know for next time, Ethan said. Are you going to pursue it? He didn't answer right away. I'll let you know. He hadn't told anyone outside of Carver and the letter exchange what had happened. He hadn't said anything to the Delray brothers or to Priya Nandini or to Marcus Delaney. He hadn't said anything to Mr. Pacheco, who would have been livid on his behalf and would have said so loudly and at length in Spanish and in English, which would have felt good and solved nothing. What he had done, without planning to, was continue being who he was. He fixed cars. He documented his work. He charged fair rates and used quality parts, and called his clients when he found something unexpected and asked before proceeding. He picked Mia up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He read the engineering books at night. He made oatmeal in the morning and drank the coffee Mia made him even when it was slightly too strong because she measured the grounds by eye. He was not, as he would have been the first to acknowledge, handling it with perfect equanimity. There were nights when the anger surfaced in ways that surprised him. Not the hot, immediate kind, but a cold, tired kind that felt like something wearing down. He'd rebuilt a machine that world-class specialists couldn't fix. He'd done it correctly, documented it thoroughly, delivered it early. And the person who benefited most from that work had looked at his invoice and decided that the rules were for people who didn't have lawyers. He thought about this more than he wanted to. He thought about the version of himself at 24, working at Verdant Motorworks, certain that skill was a sufficient armor against the world's less fair mechanics. He'd been wrong then. He was being reminded of it now. What he didn't do, what he was perhaps most careful about, though he couldn't have fully articulated why, was try to damage Isabella Hartwell's reputation. The thought had occurred to him. He knew people in automotive circles who would have found the story valuable. He knew that a quiet word in the right places could make the Hartwell Grand Touring Speciales showcase moment considerably more complicated. He could have done it. He had the documentation, the credibility, and enough industry relationships that his account would have been taken seriously. He didn't. Partly, it was self-protective. He had no interest in becoming the story and having his name attached to a public dispute that could shadow him for years in a community where reputation was everything. But partly it was something simpler and less strategic. It felt wrong. The car was real. The work was real. He had rebuilt something that had been broken, and it was going to perform correctly. And whatever Isabella Hartwell thought of him or how she'd treated the invoice, he was not going to use the quality of his own work as a weapon. He wasn't sure that was smart. He was sure it was him. The showcase was 17 days away when the situation changed without his involvement at all, and changed in a way he hadn't anticipated, which was the honest shape of how things sometimes moved in the world of people who built and drove and cared about machines. He learned about it from Roland. The driver called him on a Tuesday evening while Ethan was reseating a valve cover gasket on the Porsche, and the call came from an unknown number, but Roland identified himself immediately. "I want you to know I had no part in the decision about your payment," Roland said. He sounded careful, like a man choosing each word deliberately. "I want that on record, even if the only record is this conversation." Ethan set down the gasket scraper. "Okay," he said. "I've been talking to some people," Roland continued. "Other drivers, people who work the automotive circuit." A pause. "What happened with your invoice became known. I didn't spread it intentionally, but in these circles, it's not a large community." Ethan waited. "There's a discussion happening," Roland said, "among the professional drivers who are scheduled to operate the vehicle at the showcase, about whether they're comfortable doing so, given the circumstances." The silence stretched for a moment. "I'm not calling to ask for your blessing," Roland said. "I'm calling because you have a right to know what's happening before it happens, and because—" He paused again. "You did the work, you did it right, and the people who know machines understand what that means." Ethan sat on the garage floor with his back against the front wheel of the Porsche and looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent tube that buzzed a little louder than it should, and that he kept meaning to replace. "You're telling me drivers are going to refuse to operate the car at the showcase," Ethan said. "I'm telling you there's a discussion," Roland said carefully. "That's going to create serious problems for her." "Yes." "I didn't ask for that." "I know you didn't." Another pause. "That's part of why it's happening." After the call ended, Ethan sat on the garage floor for a long time. Mia was already asleep. The garage was quiet. The Porsche smelled of old grease and rubber, and the faint sweetness of whatever cleaning solvent he'd used on the engine bay earlier. He thought about calling Roland back and asking him to let it go. He thought about whether he had the right to do that, or whether what was happening between professional drivers and their own conscience was something he could reasonably intervene in. He thought about the showcase and the investors and the automotive press and the midnight blue car moving through the city streets correctly, the way it was supposed to, because he had spent 22 days making it so. He thought about Mia's enrichment program enrollment deadline, which was now 5 weeks away. He didn't call Roland back. He got up off the floor, finished reseating the valve cover gasket, cleaned his hands, and went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of Kellerman Avenue settling into the night, and tried to decide how he felt about the fact that the situation had moved beyond him, and whether there was anything he could or should do about it, and found that he had no clear answers to either question. What he knew was this: he had done his job. He had done it as well as he was capable of doing it. Whatever happened next was the world responding to that, in whatever shape the world chose. He was a mechanic in a garage with no sign. He fixed things. He did not control what happened after they were fixed. He closed his eyes, and after a while, he slept. The Hartwell Automotive Showcase was held at the Meridian Point Exhibition Center, a purpose-built venue on the eastern edge of the city that had been designed specifically for high-end industry events, the kind of place where the parking lot contained more combined value than most neighborhoods. The exhibition hall was glass and steel and climate-controlled to a precise temperature, and it had been booked for this event 11 months in advance. Ethan knew all of this because Marcus Delaney had written about it in his column 3 weeks earlier. He hadn't sought the article out. It had appeared in a newsletter he subscribed to, and he'd read the first 2 paragraphs before his eyes had found Isabella Hartwell's name and the description of the Grand Touring Speciale as the centerpiece of the entire event. And then he'd put his phone face down on the workbench and gone back to work. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't expected to be. The morning of the showcase, he was doing what he did most mornings. Up before 6, oatmeal on the stove, the particular silence of the garage before the street outside woke up. Mia was still asleep. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at the gray early light coming over the rooftops, and didn't let himself think too hard about what was happening across the city at the Meridian Point Exhibition Center. He had 3 jobs waiting: a brake line replacement on a 1979 Chevy truck belonging to a high school shop teacher named Bowman, who'd been a regular for 2 years; An oil cooler issue on a modern German sedan that the Delray brothers had passed to him because they were backed up and it had complications they didn't want to deal with. And the ongoing saga of a 1966 Jaguar E-Type that belonged to a retired postal worker named Herman Flack, who brought the car in every 3 months with a different problem and always stayed to watch the work and ask questions and drink the coffee Ethan made available from the machine in the corner. Normal work, real work. The kind of work that had constituted the actual texture of his life for 4 years. He was halfway through the brake line on the Bowman truck when his phone rang. It was not a number he recognized. He almost didn't answer. He was crouched under the rear of the truck with his hands in a tight space, and the phone was across the garage. But something made him stand up and cross the floor and pick it up. "Voss?" he said. The voice on the other end belonged to a man he'd never met. He identified himself as Carter Ellison and said he drove professionally for the luxury automotive circuit. His tone was direct but not unfriendly. "You're Ethan Voss. You restored the Hartwell Grand Touring Speciale." "I did. You know what's happening today?" It wasn't a question. Ethan leaned against the workbench. "I know there's a showcase," he said. "I know the car was the centerpiece." "Was," Ellison said. "There are 6 drivers scheduled for demonstration runs today. 5 of us aren't getting in the car." Ethan absorbed that. 5 out of 6. "Who's the 6th?" "Someone they brought in last minute from outside the circuit. Doesn't know the situation yet or doesn't care." A pause. "I'm calling because I thought you should know directly, not from news coverage or industry gossip." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What exactly are you telling them when you refuse?" Ellison was quiet for a moment. "That we don't operate vehicles whose safety certification can't be fully trusted, and that our ability to trust the safety of a vehicle depends on the integrity of the people who certified it. If the mechanic who rebuilt the car and knows every system inside it says it's safe, that means something. But if that mechanic hasn't been paid, if his work is being disputed after the fact, then we have no way to know what else about the situation isn't what it appears to be." "The car is safe," Ethan said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever's happening with the payment, the mechanical work is sound." "I believe you," Ellison said. "But here's the thing, Voss. You could say that the car is dangerous and we still couldn't verify it independently without access to the documentation and the repair history. What we can verify is whether the people behind the car are operating honestly. When they aren't, even in an unrelated area, we can't isolate that. Trust doesn't work that way." Ethan stood with the phone and looked at the brake line he'd been working on. He thought about what Ellison had just said and felt the truth in it. Not as something that helped him particularly, but as something that was simply correct. "I hear you," he said. "I'm not going to tell you what to do." "Wasn't asking for permission," Ellison said, pleasantly enough. "Just thought you deserved a direct conversation. Good luck with the rest of it." He hung up. Ethan set the phone down and went back to the brake line and worked in silence for a while. Through the thin wall between the garage and the apartment, he heard Mia moving around. The creak of her bed, the sound of her feet on the floor, the particular shuffling that meant she was looking for her slippers without wanting to turn the light on. By 10 o'clock, the situation at the Meridian Point Exhibition Center had apparently reached a point of public visibility. Ethan knew this because his phone started doing something it almost never did. Ringing repeatedly from numbers he didn't know. He didn't answer most of them. He answered one because the area code was local and the number felt like it might be something real. And it turned out to be a junior reporter from an automotive trade publication asking whether he had a comment on the driver walkout at the Hartwell showcase. "I don't have a comment," he said. "Are you aware that 5 of the 6 scheduled demonstration drivers have refused?" "I heard something," he said. "I don't have a comment." He hung up. He turned the ringer off. He put the phone in the office where Mia was drawing and told her not to answer it if it rang. "Why is it ringing so much?" she asked. "Work stuff." She looked at him with the expression she used when she thought he was being imprecise, but had decided not to push it. "Okay," she said. He went back to the truck. He was eating a sandwich at noon. Mia had made them again, peanut butter on wheat bread, the only thing she could reliably produce without supervision, when the knock came at the garage's side door. Not the rolling front door, the side entrance, which most people didn't know was there. He opened it. Isabella Hartwell was standing in the narrow alley beside the garage, alone. No Marsh, no Dr. Soren, no sedan with a precise driver. She was wearing the clothes she'd presumably worn to her showcase event, a structured dark dress that was now somewhat at odds with the alley's ambiance, and she looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like someone who hadn't fully prepared for the situation she was in. He stood in the doorway and waited. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "Doors open," he said, and stepped back. She came inside. She stood in the garage, in the space where her car had lived for 22 days, and looked around with the slightly unfocused look of a person recalibrating. The Bowman truck was up on the lift. The parts bins were in their order. Mia's drawings from the past month were taped along the lower portion of the wall beside the office door, including 3 different angles of the Grand Touring Speciale. Isabella's eyes stopped on those drawings for a moment. "Is she here?" she asked. "In the office," Ethan said. "She's doing her own thing. She won't bother you." Isabella nodded. She seemed to be deciding where to start, which was an unusual state for her, based on what he'd observed. She was a woman who generally arrived at conversations with a prepared position. "You know what happened this morning?" she said. "I heard from one of the drivers." Something moved across her face. "You spoke with them." "One called me. I didn't organize anything, if that's what you're thinking." "I know you didn't." She said it without particular emphasis, which was itself a kind of statement. She'd checked, apparently, and found what she'd found. "Our communications team has been managing the situation at the venue. The press coverage is—" She paused, searching for the word, "substantial." He didn't say anything. It wasn't his problem. "The one driver who stayed agreed to do a single slow demonstration loop," she said, "around the venue floor, not the planned performance run." She folded her arms, then seemed to realize she was folding them and let her hands fall to her sides. "Our major investor, a firm called Pallister Capital, pulled their representatives from the event after the walkout became public. They haven't officially communicated anything, but our internal contacts are telling us they're reviewing their position." Ethan leaned against the workbench. "That's a significant problem for you." "Yes?" "I'm not sure why you're telling me." She looked at him directly. "Because I owe you a conversation I should have had 3 weeks ago." She said it without the quality of performance he might have expected. Not rehearsed contrition, not a managed business apology, just words that seemed to cost her something. "The legal strategy regarding your invoice was recommended by our contracts team as standard procedure for disputed scope items. I approved it without—" She stopped, started again. "I approved it without adequately considering the context." The context being that the work was done correctly and within any reasonable interpretation of the agreement, Ethan said. "Yes." "And that the only reason scope was disputable was because the original contract language was written vaguely, which protects your company and not the contractor." She held his gaze. "That's also correct." The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, which was its own kind of thing. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I'd like an honest answer, not a company answer." "All right." "When Dr. Soren reviewed the work and submitted her evaluation, what did it say? Not the summary, the actual findings." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something. "She said it was, in her words, the most thorough and well-documented independent restoration she had evaluated in 14 years of this work. She said the secondary grounding repair demonstrated a level of architectural understanding of the vehicle that she found, her word, unexpected for a single practitioner without access to a full specialist team. A beat. She also said the master cylinder seal you identified and replaced would likely have failed catastrophically within 8 to 12,000 miles under standard driving conditions. Good to know the estimate was right, Ethan said. She recommended full payment of the invoice without adjustment, Isabella said. Her recommendation was overruled by the contracts team. Ethan absorbed that. Somewhere in the office, Mia dropped something, a pencil, probably, and he heard the small sound of her retrieving it without fuss. "Why are you here?" he said. Not with hostility, genuinely. Isabella looked away toward Mia's drawings on the wall. She studied them for a moment in a way that seemed involuntary. Not a calculated gesture, just someone's eyes going to something that stopped them. I needed to understand something, she said, about why what happened today happened. I've been in difficult business situations before. I've had disputes with vendors, with contractors, with partners. I've never had 5 professional drivers walk off a showcase floor in public protest. Because it's not usually about something like this, Ethan said. No, she said. It isn't. She turned back to him. I drove through this neighborhood to get here. I parked down the block and walked. A pause. I went past the tire shop and the laundry and the school, I think, a block over. She seemed to be working towards something, and he waited for her to get there. You've been here 4 years. Yeah. Building this. She gestured vaguely at the garage, at the work, at the life that surrounded it. Without the kind of infrastructure that she seemed to find the corporate language rising up and set it aside. The people around here know you. Some of them. The man at the tire shop. When I walked past, he was out front, and I think he knew who I was, or could guess, and the look he gave me. She let that thought finish itself. I've been given a lot of looks in my professional life. That one was different. Mr. Pacheco, Ethan thought, and felt a complicated warmth that he didn't show. I need to ask you something too, Isabella said, and I'd also like an honest answer. Go ahead. Why didn't you go to the press? You had the documentation, the contract, the story. Multiple outlets would have run it. The automotive journalists especially, they would have... She stopped. Why didn't you? Ethan thought about how to answer that. He thought about the version of himself sitting on the garage floor in the dark, wondering whether to call Roland back and let it go. He thought about what he'd told himself then, that it felt wrong, and tried to find words for the shape of that feeling that didn't sound either noble or dumb. Because using my own work as a weapon seemed like it would make the work into something different than what it was, he said. The car runs right. I wanted that to be the thing, not an instrument for winning an argument. She looked at him for a long time, not with the assessing quality from their earlier meetings, something quieter. That's a harder position to maintain than it sounds, she said. Yeah, he agreed. It is. From the office, Mia's voice floated through the doorway. Dad, are you still in there? Still here, he called back. Give me a few minutes. A pause. Then, okay. Is the car lady with you? He glanced at Isabella. She had the expression of someone who'd just had a very thin wall dissolved without warning. Yeah, he said. Another pause from the office. Hi, car lady, Mia said. Isabella opened her mouth and then closed it. Then, unexpectedly, Hi, she called back. Her voice had lost the CEO register entirely for that one syllable. It was just a person responding to a child, without any architecture around it. Ethan found that he liked her slightly more in that moment than he had expected to. Mia, he said toward the office, keep doing your thing. The sound of pencil on paper resumed. He turned back to Isabella. She had pulled herself back together somewhat, though not entirely, and he thought that was probably closer to the accurate version of her than most people got to see. I can have the full invoice amount transferred today, she said. I've already authorized it with accounts. I wanted to tell you in person before the notification came through. He studied her face. What changed? Today changed it. The Pallister Capital situation. She held his gaze without flinching. That too. But not only that. She paused. I watched the drivers this morning, on the venue floor when they walked away one by one. I've worked in this industry for 8 years, and I know most of those men by name. They don't make those kinds of decisions lightly. They operate expensive equipment for demanding clients in high-visibility environments, and they calculate risk very precisely. When they all arrived at the same calculation independently, and it pointed here, she gestured at the garage. I had to take that seriously, because they weren't making a statement about the payment. No, Ethan said. They were making a statement about who you are. He didn't have a response to that. It wasn't the kind of statement he'd learned to receive gracefully, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I also, she said, and then stopped for a beat. I also read the full Vanthorpe build specification, the 47 pages, last night. How much of it did you understand? A ghost of something. Not quite a smile, but close. About 60%. The rest I had Dr. Soren walk me through this morning, before the showcase. She paused. The dual-layer grounding system, page 31, the section about secondary integration through body structure. Yeah. When you told me about it on the phone, I didn't fully grasp what you were describing. I understood the words, but not what it meant to know that without being told. Doctor, Soren explained it to me this morning, that there is no documentation of the system in any of our service records. The Vanthorpe build spec was never part of our standard file for this vehicle. The only reason it was obtained was because you requested it and she had to make the call to the coach builder directly. A pause. She said finding the secondary grounding fault without that specification would have required tearing down the entire electrical system from scratch, and you identified the direction of the fault in 20 minutes of looking at the car. 25, he said. I was being careful. She looked at him, and for a moment the professional surface fell away entirely, and she was just a person looking at another person. I made a mistake, she said, not just with the invoice, with all of it. From the beginning, I walked in here ready to see what I expected to see, and I kept fitting everything into that frame, even when the evidence was... She stopped. That's not a good way to run a company, and it's not a good way to treat people. Ethan was quiet. The payment will clear today, she said. Full invoice amount plus the additional adjustment for specialty sourcing that should have been included from the start. He nodded once. She glanced toward the office doorway, toward the sound of pencil on paper and whatever Mia was drawing, then back at him. Those drawings on the wall, she said, of the car. Her work, he said. She spent a month watching me work on it. She got the roofline right. The proportions are... Isabella stopped herself, seemed to decide something. She has a good eye. She has a lot of good eyes, Ethan said. Depends on what she's looking at. A silence settled between them that wasn't exactly comfortable and wasn't exactly uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at an honest moment through a difficult route and who weren't sure what came next. One more thing, Isabella said. She reached into her jacket and produced an envelope, set it on the workbench. There's a conference in 3 weeks, Collectors Automotive Symposium, held at the Eastport Convention Center. Industry people, collectors, engineers. I'm presenting on the Grand Touring Speciale restoration. The actual story, not a sanitized version. I'd like you to be there. Ethan looked at the envelope. As what? As the person who fixed it, she said. I'm not asking you to perform anything or say anything you don't want to say. People in that room should know your name. Not because of what happened today, because of what you did in this garage for 22 days. He picked up the envelope, didn't open it. I'll think about it. She seemed to accept that as the most she was going to get, which he thought was probably accurate. She left the way she'd come, through the side door, back into the alley. He heard the sound of her heels on the cracked asphalt fading away. Mia appeared in the office doorway. She looked at the side door, then at the envelope in his hand. What's that? An invitation. To what? A car thing. She processed this. Did she apologize? Yeah, he said. She did. Good. Mia leaned against the door frame with her arms crossed, an unconscious mirror of the stance Isabella had used earlier. Did you accept? The apology? Yeah. He looked at the envelope. He thought about what accepting something meant, not the performance of it, not the words, but the actual internal movement from one position to another. He thought about the cold coffee and the kitchen table and the sparkling water Mia had put in front of him. He thought about 22 days and 61 pages of documentation and a car that ran better than it left the factory. Working on it, he said. Mia nodded like that was a satisfactory answer and went back to her drawing. He set the envelope on the shelf above the workbench, beside the folder that held the contract and the legal letters and the invoice, and he picked up his sandwich and finished eating it, and then he went back to the brake line on the Bowman truck, because it still needed to be done, and Bowman needed the truck back by Thursday. He worked through the afternoon with the radio on low. something instrumental, no voices. And the garage settled back into its ordinary rhythm. The lift hummed. The tools were where they were supposed to be. Outside, Kellerman Avenue made its regular sounds. His phone buzzed at 4:15. He wiped his hand and checked it. A bank notification. Transfer received. He looked at the amount. It was correct. Full invoice, the specialty sourcing adjustment, and something additional that he hadn't invoiced for. A figure that, when he did the math, corresponded to the 30 days of delay between completion and payment, calculated at a standard late payment rate. She'd added interest on her own late payment without being asked. He stood with the phone for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and went back to the truck. From the office doorway, Mia said, "Dad, you're smiling." "Am I?" "Yeah, you look weird." "Thanks, Mia." "You're welcome." She went back inside. He was still smiling when he finished the brake line, though he made an effort not to, because it was a brake line and there was no reason a brake line should make a person smile, and maintaining some standards felt important. It was a small thing, the interest. Probably her accountant had flagged it as a liability and recommended it. Maybe it was purely procedural, a detail managed by someone in the finance department who never knew the shape of the situation, or maybe it was what it looked like. A person who had done something wrong trying to correct it as fully as she could once she'd decided to correct it. He didn't know which it was. He suspected he'd never know for certain. He finished the truck and washed up and went inside to make dinner. Mia sat at the counter and told him about the rock she'd read about in her book, obsidian, volcanic glass, how it formed when lava cooled so fast the molecules didn't have time to arrange themselves into crystals. She was fascinated by the quickness of it, by the idea that speed could create something so solid. "So it's basically frozen movement," Mia said. Ethan thought about that while he heated the soup. "Yeah," he said. "That's a good way to put it." She seemed pleased with herself. She picked up a pencil she'd brought from her table and turned it in her fingers. "Are you going to go to the car thing?" "Maybe." "You should." "Why?" She shrugged with the specific artlessness of a 7-year-old saying something she considered obvious. "Because you fixed it. You should get to be there when it goes." He looked at his daughter. She had already moved on, pencil moving across whatever scrap of paper she'd found on the counter, drawing something he couldn't see from where he was standing. Just another thing she'd said and was done with, filed under complete. He turned back to the soup. The envelope was still on the shelf above the workbench, visible through the open garage door from where he stood. He didn't take it down. He left it there for now, as a question he wasn't fully ready to answer, sitting in the quiet above everything else. The envelope stayed on the shelf for 4 days. Ethan walked past it every morning when he came into the garage, and every evening when he turned off the lights, and he neither opened it nor threw it away, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't fully formed yet. Mia noticed it. She noticed most things, but she didn't bring it up again after that first night. She had the patience, unusual in a 7-year-old, of someone who understood that some decisions needed to breathe before they could be made. On the 5th morning, a Thursday, he opened it. Inside was a single card with the Collectors Automotive Symposium details, date, venue, time, and a handwritten note on Hartwell Industries letterhead in handwriting that was small and precise and looked like it belonged to someone who'd been taught penmanship seriously and had partially unlearned it through years of typing everything. The note said, "No obligation to speak. No obligation to represent anything other than yourself. The car will be there. So will the people who should know who made it right." It was signed with her first name only, not Isabella Hartwell, CEO, just Isabella. He put the card in his shirt pocket and went to make oatmeal. The symposium was on a Saturday, which meant Mia didn't have school, which meant the question of what to do with her solved itself before he'd consciously raised it. "You're coming," he told her Thursday evening. She looked up from her homework. Multiplication tables, which she found deeply uninteresting compared to geological formations but was working through with grim competence. "To the car thing?" "To the car thing." She considered this. "Do I have to dress up?" "Wear something clean." "My green shirt is clean." "Wear the green shirt." She went back to her multiplication. He went back to the coolant leak on Herman Flack's Jaguar, which had developed a new opinion about where it wanted to seep from, and they spent the evening in parallel the way they usually did, each absorbed in their own work, occasionally interrupting each other, the garage full of the particular comfortable noise of two people who didn't need to perform anything for one another. He didn't tell anyone else he was going. He didn't call Marcus Delaney, though Delaney would almost certainly be at the symposium and would almost certainly find him anyway. He didn't tell the Del Rey brothers or Priya Nandini or Mr. Pacheco. He told Herman Flack because Herman was supposed to pick up the Jaguar that Friday, and Ethan needed to explain he'd be unavailable Saturday if any follow-up was needed, and Herman had responded with a 20-minute monologue about the importance of industry recognition that Ethan had listened to while replacing the coolant hose and making the appropriate sounds of acknowledgement. Friday night, he paid the deposit on Mia's enrichment program enrollment. He'd been putting it off. Not because the money wasn't there now, it was. The transfer had cleared and the account looked different than it had in 4 years. Solidly different in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. But because doing it felt like closing a chapter, and he'd wanted to be certain the chapter was actually closed before he did. He sat at the kitchen table with the laptop and filled out the enrollment form and entered the payment information and clicked submit. And the confirmation email came back in 40 seconds with Mia's name in the subject line, and he read it twice and then closed the laptop. Mia was already asleep. He thought about waking her to tell her. He decided the morning was a better time for good news. Let her have an intact night's sleep and then give her the thing to wake up to. He put the laptop away and sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet, listening to the building settle around him, the distant sound of a dog somewhere on Kellerman, the hum of the refrigerator. He felt not happiness exactly, but something in the same neighborhood. The specific relief of a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was there, finally set down somewhere you trusted. The Eastport Convention Center was 40 minutes across the city, and they left early enough that Ethan could find parking without the specific stress of event day lots. Mia wore the green shirt and her good jeans and her hair in a braid that she'd done herself and that was slightly uneven on the left side. And she'd brought her sketchbook in a canvas bag because she brought it everywhere, which he'd long since stopped questioning. The symposium registration was in a marble-floored lobby that smelled of coffee and the particular clean scent of expensive climate control. There were name badges on a long table. Ethan found his, printed in a font that looked professional and felt strange to see, Ethan Voss in clean letters without any other description beneath it, just his name. And there were people in the lobby who wore their industry credentials the way some people wear their age, visibly and with investment. A few of them looked at his name badge. A few of them looked at him with the expression of people recalibrating. He was wearing his good shirt, a dark gray one that Mia had approved without being asked, and he'd gotten a haircut the previous week for the first time in 3 months. But he still looked like what he was, and he was aware of that, and he had made a decision somewhere around the 40-minute drive over that he was going to be comfortable with it, or at least behave as though he was. Mia had no such concerns. She walked through the lobby looking at everything with the frank, interested gaze of someone who found the world generally worth examining, and found a bowl of wrapped mints on the registration table that she helped herself to with the easy confidence of a person who sees no reason to feel out of place anywhere. "This place is big," she observed. "Convention centers tend to be." "Is the car here?" "Should be." She nodded and looked around. "Where do we go?" He consulted the program. Main exhibition hall, ground floor. He'd expected to feel more out of place than he did. What he actually felt was something closer to tired alertness. The state he recognized from complicated jobs, when there was a lot to track and the margin for error was small, and the only useful response was focus. The exhibition hall was substantial. There were perhaps 30 vehicles on display, a range of collector cars, concept vehicles, and industry showcases, each positioned under carefully angled lighting that made them look like something between machinery and sculpture. Industry people moved between them in the unhurried way of professionals who were also, underneath the professionalism, enthusiasts. The Hartwell Grand Touring Speciale was in the center of the hall. They both saw it at the same moment. Ethan and Mia, standing in the entrance, and the midnight blue car under the overhead lights looking the way it always looked, which was like something made by people who cared deeply about making it. There was a small crowd around it. A display board beside it showed a technical breakdown of the restoration, not simplified actual engineering detail, with photographs of the repair stages that Ethan recognized from his own documentation. His photographs. His documentation. He stood still for a moment. Dad? Mia said. Yeah. That's your work on the board. Yeah, he said again. She looked up at him and then back at the display, and she had the expression she used when she was adding something to the internal file of things she considered important. She didn't say anything else about it. She just walked forward, into the hall, toward the car, with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. He followed her. He was looking at the display board, at a photograph of the secondary grounding repair, the interior panel partially removed, the integration point exposed, that particular Tuesday afternoon's work captured in an image, when he became aware of someone standing beside him. You actually came, Marcus Delaney said. Ethan turned. Delaney was in his late 60s, with the build of someone who'd once been athletic and had transitioned into a different relationship with his body without much complaint, and he had the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years observing things carefully. He was holding a coffee in a paper cup and looking at the display board. You knew about this? Ethan asked. Isabella called me 2 weeks ago, Delaney said. Asked me what I knew about you. Not about your skills. She apparently had that covered. About who you are. He sipped the coffee. I told her what I knew. Which was that you're the most technically capable person I've seen work on a car since Callaway at Verdant, and that you have, in my observation, a stubborn allergy to shortcuts that has probably cost you money and clients over the years, and that you've never seemed particularly interested in changing. He paused. I also told her what happened at Verdant, the contract situation, the business partners. Ethan looked at him. She asked, Delaney said simply. I thought she should know. Why? Because people who've been burned by dishonest contracts and kept working honestly afterward are a specific and notable category of person, Delaney said. And I thought it was relevant context. He turned from the display board to look at the car. She put your documentation on that board herself, you know. Went through the 61 pages and chose the photographs. Marsh wanted to produce a branded visual summary, and she said no. Ethan looked at the display, at his photographs, at the handwritten annotations in his own notation style that had been reproduced at scale. She could have used the documentation and left my name off it, he said. She could have, Delaney agreed. A lot of people would have. He finished his coffee and crumpled the cup. How much of the story do you want me to write up? For the column? None of it, Ethan said. Delaney looked at him without surprise. The walkout is already public. The payment dispute is circulating in industry circles. Some version of the story is going to be written regardless. Then let someone else write it. The versions other people write won't be accurate. Most things aren't, Ethan said. That's not my problem to fix. Delaney studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly, but the recognition of a position he'd heard clearly. All right, he said. But if you change your mind, the offer stands. He looked past Ethan. Is that your daughter? Ethan turned. Mia had found her way to the car itself and was standing at the driver's side, not touching it, studying the door seam with her head tilted in the exact angle he used when he was examining a panel gap. One of the event staff had apparently noticed her and, rather than moving her back, had crouched down to say something to her. And Mia was responding with the serious, direct engagement she gave to adults who spoke to her like people. Yeah, Ethan said. She's looking at that car the way restorers look at cars, Delaney said. She's been watching me work since she could walk. Delaney was quiet for a moment. You know what I think, he said, is the actual story here? Not the walkout, not the payment dispute. He gestured at Mia, at the car, at the space between them. That. Ethan didn't answer. He watched his daughter study the door seam of a car he'd spent 22 days rebuilding and felt something that he wasn't going to name in a convention center lobby, but that he would have recognized, if pressed, as the closest thing he knew to uncomplicated joy. He excused himself from Delaney and went to stand beside Mia. The gap is even, she said without looking up, meaning the door seam. Both sides. That's how it's supposed to be. It wasn't when it came in? The body repair from the highway incident had shifted it slightly. I adjusted it during the panel reassembly. She nodded. Good. As though she'd been worried about it and was now satisfied. She straightened up and looked at the car's roofline, then at her sketchbook, then back at the roofline. Can I draw it? It's a public exhibition. Nobody's going to stop you. She sat down cross-legged on the floor beside the car, on the polished convention center floor in her good jeans without any self-consciousness about it whatsoever, and opened her sketchbook and began to draw. The event staff member who'd spoken to her earlier watched this happen and looked at Ethan. He shrugged slightly. She smiled and went back to her post. Ethan stood beside his daughter and the car he'd rebuilt and looked around the hall at the people who built and preserved and valued machines and felt, despite everything, despite the weeks of the unpaid invoice and the legal letters and the cold, quiet anger of those kitchen table nights, that there was something right about being here. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just right. He heard Isabella before he saw her. Not her voice. The change in the room, a subtle shift in attention, the way a space adjusts when someone with authority enters it. He turned. She came across the wall with Marsh 2 steps behind and Dr. Soren beside her. She was dressed appropriately for the venue, put together, controlled, the public version, but when she saw him, something in her posture changed slightly. Not a softening, exactly. More like a held breath released. She looked at Mia on the floor with the sketchbook, then at Ethan. You came, she said. You said the car would be here. I did. She looked at the display board. Something moved across her face, something genuine beneath the composure. I want you to know that the presentation this afternoon covers the complete restoration history, all of it, including the payment dispute and the resolution. He looked at her. You're going to tell an industry audience you tried to underpay your mechanic. I'm going to tell them that our standard contract practices failed an independent contractor and that we've since changed them. She held his gaze. Marsh has been working with our legal team for the past 2 weeks. We've rewritten our independent contractor agreements, scope language, payment protections, mandatory Dr. Soren level technical sign-off before any invoice adjustment. It goes into effect across all Hartwell Industries operations next month. He was quiet. It won't undo what happened, she said, but it means it doesn't happen again, not to the next person. He thought about the person she was, the woman who'd walked into his garage 7 weeks ago and looked at his toolbox with the expression of someone revising their expectations downward. He thought about the conversation in the alley, the note on the card, the handwriting that was small and precise. People were complicated. He'd always known that and had never quite stopped being surprised by the specific shapes the complication took. I think that's the right call, he said. She nodded, a beat of silence between them. Will you be at the presentation? When is it? 2 o'clock, main stage. He glanced at Mia, who was deep in her drawing and appeared to have no interest in the conversation happening 2 feet above her head. We'll be around, he said. Isabella looked at the display board one more time. Dr. Soren told me something last week that I keep thinking about, she said. She said that the reason the dual-layer grounding system failed isn't just that the body repair was done incorrectly. It's that the people doing the body repair weren't told the system existed because Vanthorpe considers it proprietary. So the information was locked up, and the car suffered for it. She paused. I asked her what the lesson was. She said the lesson was that when expertise is hidden or undervalued, the machines pay for it eventually. Ethan looked at her. She's a smart woman. She is. Isabella looked at him directly. So are you, Mr. Voss, whatever you decide to do with that. She moved on into the hall, Marsh following, and the room's attention followed her, and Ethan stood with his daughter and the midnight blue car and the display board showing 61 pages of his own careful work, and breathed. From the floor, Mia said, She apologized again. You were listening. I wasn't trying not to. She didn't look up from the drawing. What did she change? The contracts. How they deal with independent workers going forward. Mia was quiet for a moment, pencil moving. So other people won't get the same problem you had. That's the idea. She thought about this. That's better than just paying you, she said finally. Paying you is just fixing one thing. Changing the contracts fixes it for everyone. He looked at the top of his daughter's head, at the slightly uneven braid, the way she held the pencil too close to the tip when she was concentrating, the particular stillness she got when she was working seriously on something. "Yeah," he said, "that's a good way to see it." The 2 o'clock presentation was held in a tiered auditorium off the main hall, and it was fuller than Ethan expected. He and Mia found seats in the 4th row. Mia with her sketchbook still open across her knees, already adding details she'd collected from other cars in the hall. And Ethan sat with his arms resting on his thighs and watched the stage. Isabella presented with the particular quality she had in all professional settings: controlled, precise, no wasted words. But the content of the presentation was different from what he'd anticipated. It wasn't a company showcase. It was, as close as he could tell, an honest account. She walked through the restoration timeline accurately, including the 3 previous specialists who had failed to resolve the issues. She explained the dual-layer grounding system and why it had been missed. She showed the documentation photographs, his photographs, and credited them by name on the slides. Documentation and repair. Ethan Voss, Voss Automotive, Kellerman Avenue. She covered the payment dispute without euphemism. She said the contract language had been ambiguous in ways that benefited Hartwell Industries at the contractor's expense, and that the company had used that ambiguity in a manner that was technically defensible and fundamentally wrong. The room was quiet during this section, the specific quiet of an industry audience recognizing a practice they'd seen before, seeing it named plainly. She covered the driver walkout at the showcase without framing it as a crisis. She framed it as a corrective. She said that the automotive community had demonstrated something she should have already understood, that the integrity of a machine cannot be separated from the integrity of the people who work on it, and that when a skilled craftsman is treated as replaceable, the assumption being made is that the craft itself is replaceable, and that assumption is always, eventually, expensive. She announced the contract reform without fanfare. 1 slide, the key changes listed clearly, the implementation date confirmed. Then she said, "The person whose work is on those photographs in the exhibition hall is in this room. His name is Ethan Voss. I'm not going to ask him to stand up, because I suspect he'd find that uncomfortable, and because the work should speak for itself. But if any of you are ever in the position of needing someone who will read 47 pages of documentation in one night and find the problem that 3 specialist firms missed, I'd suggest you call the garage on Kellerman Avenue." A section of the room, the drivers, he realized, several of them were here, Carter Ellison and Roland and others he didn't know by name, began to applaud, and then it spread, and Ethan sat in the 4th row with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance and did not stand up. Because she was right, he found it uncomfortable, but he felt it nonetheless. Beside him, Mia was clapping with the full-bodied enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who had decided something was worth clapping for, her sketchbook nearly falling off her lap, her face bright with a pride she had no reason to be complicated about. He reached over and steadied the sketchbook so it didn't fall. After the presentation in the lobby, Marcus Delaney found him again. "Still don't want me to write it?" Delaney said. Ethan thought about it for a real moment this time, not a reflexive one. "Write the part about the contract reform," he said. "That's worth people knowing about." Delaney studied him. "And the rest?" "Is just a guy who fixed a car." "That's not—" Delaney started. "Marcus," Ethan said, "let it be what it is." Delaney was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "The contract reform piece. I can do that." They shook hands and Delaney moved off through the lobby crowd, and Ethan stood and watched him go and thought about what it meant to let a thing be what it was rather than what other people wanted to make of it. What it had been was this: a broken car. A man who knew how to fix it. A disagreement about what that knowledge was worth. A community of people who decided independently and without coordination that the disagreement meant something beyond the money. And a woman who could have let the situation resolve in her favor and chose, at some cost to her own pride, to resolve it more honestly. None of these things were simple, looked at straight on. None of them were what they'd seemed at the beginning. That was the other thing about complex systems, automotive or human, that Ethan had learned over 15 years of taking things apart and putting them back together. The presenting symptom was almost never the actual problem. The actual problem was deeper, older, more structural. You could chase symptoms forever and never fix anything. You had to go back to where the fault first formed and work from there. Isabella Hartwell had gone back. Whatever her reasons, the Pallister Capital situation, the driver walkout, the genuine moment in the alley that he suspected had cost her more than she'd shown, she had gone back to where the fault was and tried to address it from there. The contract reform was the proof of that. Not, I'm sorry to this person, but I'm changing the system so this doesn't happen again. That was harder. That was worth more. He wasn't sure how he felt about her. He suspected he'd never have a clean feeling about her, because the situation hadn't been clean, and he'd spent enough time working on real things to have no expectation that the world would resolve itself into clean feelings. She was someone who had done something wrong and then done something right, and that was a human thing, which meant it was complicated, which meant he'd probably be thinking about it off and on for years in the way you think about situations that reshaped something in you without your permission. On the drive home, Mia was in the passenger seat with her sketchbook open across her knees, adding shading to the drawing of the car she'd been working on all day. The late afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle, warm and specific, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they meant something. "Dad?" Mia said. "Yeah." "When I'm old enough, can I work in the garage?" He kept his eyes on the road. "You already do." "I mean on the cars, not just watching." He thought about this, about the drawings she'd been making for 2 years, the way she'd corrected him that morning about obsidian. Frozen movement, she'd said, and she'd been exactly right. The quality of attention she brought to things that interested her, which was the single most important quality a person could have for this kind of work. More important than technical knowledge, which could be learned, more important than tools, which could be acquired. "You can start on the Jaguar," he said, "when Herman brings it back. Small stuff first, fluid checks, visual inspection, documentation." She looked up from the sketchbook. "Really?" "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully decode. It was layered, 7 years of accumulated seriousness and hope, and the particular brightness of a kid who's just been told that the thing they want is actually available to them. Then she went back to the drawing, and he could see from the way the pencil moved that she was working faster than before, with a new kind of energy in it. He drove through the city as the light changed, past the elevated highway where the Grand Touring Speciale had blown a tire 7 weeks earlier and started everything, past the business districts and the older neighborhoods and the particular geography of a city that was always, depending on where you looked, both declining and rebuilding. He turned onto Kellerman Avenue and pulled up in front of the garage and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The garage with no sign, the cracked asphalt lot, the tire shop next door where Mr. Pacheco would be locking up about now, the small apartment in the back with the 2 rooms and the shelf full of engineering books, and the mini fridge where sandwiches sometimes appeared without announcement. His, theirs. Mia closed the sketchbook and looked at the garage and then at him. "Did today go okay?" she asked. He thought about the display board with his photographs, about Delaney's offer, declined and reaccepted in a narrower form, about Roland and Carter Ellison and the other drivers who'd made a decision that wasn't his to make and had made it for reasons that came back, finally, to the same thing, that the work mattered, and that the people who do it matter too, and that these things are not separable no matter how convenient it might sometimes be to treat them as though they are. About Mia on the convention center floor, cross-legged in her good jeans, drawing the car he'd rebuilt. "Yeah," he said, "I think it went okay." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and opened the door and got out, and he could hear her humming something tuneless under her breath. A habit she'd gotten from him, though neither of them had ever acknowledged this, as she walked toward the apartment door. He sat for another moment in the truck. There is a particular temptation when something difficult resolves to want the resolution to be total, to want the ending to be clean, the lesson to be simple, the people involved to be either fully redeemed or fully blamed. Life doesn't work that way, and Ethan Voss was not a man who had ever been able to sustain comfortable illusions for very long. He knew that Isabella Hartwell would go back to running her company with the same hard intelligence and the same occasional ruthlessness that had built it, and that the contract reforms would help some people and inevitably fail others in ways nobody had anticipated yet. He knew that the automotive world would move on from the showcase walkout story as industry stories always moved on, absorbed into the general noise. He knew that the invoice money was real, and the enrichment program deposit was paid, and the Jaguar would come back with a new problem, and Herman Flack would stay and ask questions, and the Del Rey brothers would send overflow work, and Priya Nandini would call when she had something interesting, and Mr. Pacheco would bring tamales on the first Friday of next month. He knew that Mia was going to start working on cars, really working, and that she was going to be remarkable at it, not because she was his daughter, but because she already was remarkable, in the specific, undramatic way that competent people with good attention usually are. What he didn't know, what nobody could know, which was the thing people most reliably forgot, was what the next problem would be, or where it would come from, or whether he'd have what it took to handle it when it arrived. You could document 61 pages of a single job and still walk into the next one knowing nothing. That was the actual nature of the work. That was the actual nature of most things. He turned off the truck engine. The garage was quiet around him. Through the apartment window, he could see the light on in Mia's room, her shadow moving as she put her sketchbook away and began the particular evening negotiation with herself about whether she felt like brushing her teeth before or after reading. He got out of the truck. He walked past the rolling door of the garage and paused to look inside at the space where the Grand Touring Speciale had lived for 22 days. At the oil-stained floor and the ordered parts bins and the diagnostic equipment and the shelf where the invoice folder still sat above the workbench, the legal letters inside it now a closed chapter. He thought about what Dr. Soren had said, as relayed through Isabella. When expertise is hidden or undervalued, the machines pay for it eventually. True of machines. True of most systems that depend on skilled people to function and pretend, for convenience, that they don't. He turned off the garage light and went inside. Mia had already decided the teeth-brushing question in favor of getting it done first, which he took as a sign that something was going right with her general development, and she appeared in the bathroom doorway with toothpaste on her chin, asking whether obsidian was technically a mineral or a rock. And he told her it was classified as a mineraloid, which was a third thing she hadn't considered, and her expression when he said it was the best thing he'd seen all day. They ate dinner late, pasta from whatever was in the cabinet, nothing fancy, the kind of meal that existed to be eaten rather than to mean anything. And Mia told him about a girl in her class who was also interested in rocks, and with whom she'd begun trading specimens at recess, a small economy of geological samples that had apparently been operating for 2 weeks without his knowledge. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I forgot," she said. "You were busy with the car." He thought about the 22 days, the early mornings and the late nights, and the particular focused tunnel of his attention when a complex problem was open in front of him. He thought about the sandwiches that had appeared in the mini-fridge, the coffee that was sometimes slightly too strong, the drawings taped along the lower wall. "Sorry," he said. She shrugged with the easy forgiveness of a kid who had long since made peace with the fact that her father's attention was sometimes subdivided by machines that needed it. "It's okay. The car was important." "So was the rock trade." She considered this seriously. "It's mostly basalt and quartz right now. She found a piece of rose quartz near the creek by the park, and it's really good." "Rose quartz is solid," he agreed. "I gave her a piece of obsidian." "Frozen movement," he said. She grinned, a real one, unguarded, the kind she gave without thinking when something caught her right. And he held that in the way he held the moments that mattered, without reaching for them too hard, just letting them be what they were. Later, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was actually hot this time, and let the quiet settle around him, and thought about what the past 7 weeks had been, and what they'd changed and what they hadn't. He was still the man in the garage with no sign. He would probably always be that man, not because he lacked the ability to be something larger, but because the garage was where the real work was, and the real work was the thing he'd never been able to walk away from for very long. Some people were built for the front of the room, for the presentations and the industry events, and the name on the building. He was built for the underside of the car, for the fluorescent light, and the 61 pages, and the moment at 2 in the morning when the problem finally gave up its answer. That wasn't a consolation. It wasn't a settling. It was just the accurate description of who he was. What had changed was smaller and more real: the account balance, the enrichment program deposit, the contract reforms that would go into effect next month across Hartwell Industries, and that Delaney would write about in his column, and that might make a version of this slightly less likely to happen to the next person who did good work and got handed ambiguous paperwork in exchange, and Mia learning to look at a door seam the way restorers look at door seams. That last one, he thought, sitting in the quiet kitchen with the hot coffee and the sound of Kellerman Avenue settling into night, that last one was the one that would last the longest. Not the money, not the recognition, not even the car itself, which would be driven and displayed and eventually would belong to someone else, but a 7-year-old with a sketchbook and a good eye, who had sat on a convention center floor and drawn the thing her father had fixed and gotten the roofline right. That was what stayed. That was what lasted. And in the end, that was more than enough.